Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a deep dive into an insightful discussion from a recent YouTube interview. It's with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He's a combat veteran, former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. And the source material, well, it gives us a unique, sometimes provocative perspective on Ukraine, global power shifts, and, the future of alliances.
Absolutely. Our mission today is really to unpack Colonel Macgregor's analysis. We want to pull out those key nuggets of knowledge about what he believes is really happening on the ground. The motivations of the major players, the potential implications for Europe, for the U.S. What's fascinating here is just the sheer breadth of his analysis. He connects military realities to economic and historical forces. It really challenges conventional thinking.
Okay, let's unpack this right away then. The source points to what looks like a pretty significant shift in President Trump's approach to Ukraine. Initially, he had that very bold claim, right? Ending the war in 24 hours. But now, recent actions. Reports about pressuring India on trade with Russia, suggesting Ukraine must go on the offensive, maybe sending long-range ATACMS missiles. Seems like a very different picture. What does Macgregor say is driving these apparent contradictions?
Well, Colonel Macgregor calls this vintage Trump. He describes him as someone, and this is a quote, with a machine gun firing in all conceivable directions. He suggests Trump's thoughts change from day to day because he's, very impulsive. Macgregor asserts there's just no coherent strategic framework there.
Yeah.
And no understanding whatsoever of Russia or Ukraine or Eastern Europe.
No.
So basically, he sees Trump's policy as, much more reactive than strategic.
Right. So less about a calculated long-term strategy, more moment-to-moment reactions based on different pressures.
Precisely. Macgregor puts this down to a mix of things. First, he talks about optics and personal benefit. He argues Trump is a pure showman, really focused on photo opportunities, almost like a reality TV show. And according to Macgregor, when Trump figured out he couldn't stage this wonderful photo opportunity as a peacemaker, between Putin, Zelensky, the Europeans, who all have different goals, he just walked away from that angle. The personal benefit wasn't there.
That makes a certain kind of sense, considering his public persona. What other pressures does Macgregor bring up?
At the same time, Macgregor claims Trump is under enormous pressure from the neocons inside the Beltway. He paints these figures as pushing for perpetual war, even suggesting they want to balkanize Iran and Russia.
Yeah.
So this internal push, the one for continued support to Ukraine, Macgregor thinks that leads to these almost schizophrenic outcomes in foreign policy.
Okay, so a mix of personal image and significant political pressure. Is there maybe also a deeper issue, like understanding the conflict itself?
Absolutely. Macgregor really emphasizes a lack of military and diplomatic understanding. He points to Trump's background as a businessman, seeing the world through that specific lens, focused on making deals. He argues Trump lacks experience in the long game of international diplomacy, the months and years it requires. And Macgregor also says Trump doesn't really grasp the crucial difference between a deep fight that's long-range strikes and a close fight, meaning ground forces. He's quite emphatic that Ukraine has lost the close fight, suggesting these long-range missiles, they won't fundamentally change what's happening on the ground.
That's a really critical distinction in military terms, yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, Macgregor connects Trump's style to something broader in American culture.
He does. He links it to what he sees as a broader American character that, in his words, has no patience. He says Americans view the world like a giant microwave oven, expecting instant results. Macgregor contends this just doesn't work in international relations or military affairs. You can't rush these complex, long-term problems. So the core insight here from Macgregor is that a leader's personal style, plus political pressures, plus maybe a national impatience, can override a coherent strategy in these really complex situations.
Okay, moving from those high-level political calculations, Macgregor then dives into what he calls the grim reality on the Ukrainian battlefield. This is where his military background really comes through. He paints a very bleak picture. What does he say is actually happening there, and what does that mean for Ukraine?
Macgregor is blunt. He says the situation's been going from bad to worse for the Ukrainian army for many, many months now. He says it's reached a point of being more horrific than ever before. He doesn't hold back on Ukrainian weakness. He describes them as effectively naked on the battlefield. Why? Because of, quote, no air and missile defense to speak of.
Oh.
And also a critical lack of satellite imagery being transmitted instantaneously to key nodes.
He mentioned critical nodes being destroyed, too. What exactly does he mean by that?
Right. These critical nodes, they're essentially key logistics, command centers. Places like Shazafar, Cherkov, he mentioned. He reports many of these have been utterly and completely destroyed. That suggests, a severe crippling of Ukraine's ability to operate. He also highlights something else significant, unacknowledged losses of what he claims are NATO officers and non-commissioned officers. That implies a deeper, maybe unpublicized Western involvement and a higher cost than officially stated. And add to that a serious manpower drain. Macgregor claims 14,000 young men, 1830, have been allowed to cross borders into Poland, Slovakia, elsewhere. He even describes the Ukrainian government itself as schizophrenic, trying to maintain this fiction that they're still resilient and capable while also beginning to surrender to the demands of their own population to put an end to this.
Wow. That is a truly grim assessment for Ukraine's military situation. But on the other side, Macgregor makes this really astonishing claim about Russian losses, single digits daily. Does he offer any sort of basis for that number in his analysis? It seems very different from other estimates out there.
He does assert that Russian losses are single digits, often 10 or less per day. It's a huge contrast he draws. Now, in this interview, he doesn't present specific battlefield data points for that exact figure, but his reasoning ties into his larger claim of Russian dominance. He insists the Russians are in control of the entire battle space. He sees the situation as irretrievable for Ukraine, saying it's not something that can be fixed by sending over cruise missiles. He even suggests Russian special forces in the western part of Ukraine are already providing targeting data, just illustrating their level of control.
And the strategic city of Odessa, what does he see happening there?
Odessa, he notes, has been under ferocious attack. Its military capability is gone, he says. Fuel and ammunition has been destroyed. Macgregor predicts the Russians will cross the river in strength and move south to seize Odessa. And he emphasizes its historical Russian identity founded by Catherine the Great, part of what was called New Russia. That highlights the deeper historical claims he thinks are driving things.
And what about Kyiv itself, the capital? Is that future clear in his view?
He says that the unknown at this point is what do the Russians do about Kiev and about the lingering facade of a government there, especially since he notes Putin and Lavrov have said Zelensky is not a legitimate president anymore. So the core insight from this part is Macgregor's really stark view. The battlefield is beyond repair for Ukraine, Russian dominance is overwhelming, Ukrainian will is collapsing, and significant territory shifts are likely coming.
Given that battlefield assessment, it really begs the question, why does Macgregor believe so many in the West, especially in NATO countries, seem to misunderstand Russia so deeply? He's pretty blunt about it.
Yeah, he is. He argues many European leaders actually do understand the truth, but they've chosen the lie. His perspective is they cling to this fiction that Russia is evil and a danger and a threat. Why? Because, as he puts it, the moment they admit that what they've said about Russia is false, like acknowledging Russia's national security interests in eastern Ukraine are legitimate, which he connects to the rights of Russian citizens to speak and read and write their own language, then politically they are through. So it's about political expediency, political survival, in his view.
So a calculated political choice, not necessarily genuine misunderstanding, at least for some leaders. He also mentions an underlying economic crisis in Europe playing a role.
Yes, Macgregor points to what he calls an underlying economic crisis. He claims European globalist governments, governments focused on international cooperation, figures like Starmer, Macron, Mayer, in a lot of trouble. He talks about a debt spiral, an impending financial system collapse, and he believes this will force a reset the currency and lead to new governments. He even cites the AfD in Germany, the alternative for Germany, as an example of a legitimate political movement gaining ground because of this.
And what about Europe's military capabilities?
Yeah.
He's quite dismissive of any talk of a European peace force.
Very dismissive. He calls it meaningless nonsense. He states that building a viable new military establishment takes, conservatively speaking, 10 years. He points out Poland's position, which he calls wise, that there will be no Polish troops on the ground in Ukraine, noting their previous losses. He actually believes the Orban model, Hungary's nationalist, sovereignty-first approach, is going to become increasingly popular in Central East Europe. And he thinks that spells the end of the EU and NATO.
And then there's his idea of the daddy syndrome, this search for permanent security.
Right. The source mentions the dream of the unipolar order after the Cold War. States felt they didn't need to worry about anyone else's security. Macgregor is critical of this search for this daddy or permanent security, as he puts it, how Europeans look for someone who's going to be daddy. His advice is that Europeans need to decide what's in their interest, not just rely on Fort Trump, as he terms it, or U.S. guarantees. He even warns that just having access to the new money machine of EU subsidies could, ironically, make states a target for future destruction.
He also frames Russia's actions in an unexpected way. arguing they're somehow standing up for Europe. How does he explain that?
It's a strong claim. Macgregor argues Russia is standing up for Europe in ways that no one ever anticipated. How? By pushing back, in his view, against a multicultural mess with open borders and no national identity. It's a very specific framing of Russia's role and identity from his perspective. So the core idea here is Macgregor's belief that European leaders are caught in a politically convenient but ultimately unsustainable lie about Russia, driven by economic problems and this dependency on outside security, which he thinks will ultimately lead to the unraveling of the EU and NATO.
Okay, that brings us naturally to the future of these alliances, particularly NATO. Macgregor seems to think it's fundamentally flawed. He's critical of its expansion.
Yeah, he reminds us NATO was originally for states bordering the Atlantic, but in the 90s it became this continental structure.
Yeah.
With the goal, he says, to advance all the way to the Urals and beyond. And he declares that strategy has clearly and indisputably failed.
And he questions the whole idea of permanent alliances that automatically trigger conflict, drawing that parallel to World War I. What's his alternative for security?
He asks, why do you want to be part of alliances that could ultimately drag you into a war that you really don't want to fight? Referencing those automatic triggers of WWI. He uses Finland as an example. Finland for years guaranteed its own security with a strong military, but then decides to join a NATO alliance which has committed itself to a permanent hostility towards Russia. Macgregor calls that insane. He argues Europeans need to be their own first responders, building real military capability for their own purposes. He suggests maybe limited liability partners for specific tasks rather than, as he puts it, a permanent alliance that triggers automatically a war.
He also sees the U.S. itself undergoing a major shift in its global role, doesn't he? Sort of reversion back to an earlier form of power.
Exactly. He foresees the U.S. reversion back to what it really was before World War I, a maritime and aerospace power, not a land power. Yeah. She says the idea of put of hundreds of thousands, if not a million or 2 million troops into the battle, whether it's Asia or Europe, is crazy with modern tech. He even brings up Eisenhower's comment from 1956 about no more Normandy-style landings. He argues the U.S. simply will not remain a global land power. Forces overseas will decline. He thinks eventually we'll have fewer forces on the ground overseas, and pretty soon we won't have any in the Eastern Hemisphere beyond special forces. He states bluntly, America is in retreat. No, we're reverting to what is natural. Our position is in the Western Hemisphere. He links the narrative to demonize Russia and China and eventually Iran to justifying massive defense spending, but he believes Americans don't really support that. So, the core insight here is Macgregor calling for a fundamental rethink of security alliances and predicting a U.S. shift away from being a global land power based on history and modern reality.
So, as we look towards what many see as the final stages of this war, what does Macgregor suggest the relationship between Russia and the West will actually look like? We're hearing about growing Ukrainian resentment, diverging views even within the pro-Western camp itself.
Well, Colonel Macgregor believes the Russian interest clearly stated at this point is we want a solution that does not require us in 2, 5, 10 years' time to resume the conflict. So he sees them aiming for something definitive long-term.
And how does he see the Ukrainian population's perspective evolving? He made a pretty striking comment about their feelings using a rather uncomfortable historical analogy.
Yeah, he notes that Ukrainians are showing some indications that there's some growing resentfulness. A feeling that they thought they were going to be under some protective umbrella by the West, and now feel, in his words, used by proxy. He points to polling data, claiming 69% of Ukrainians now say that they want an immediate end to the fighting through negotiations, which contrasts sharply, he notes, with European reluctance to talk to Russia. And yes, he mentions that Russian historical reference to Ukraine as Russia's unfaithful wife. It's a powerful analogy he uses to capture that perceived sense of betrayal.
That is a powerful image. And he sees deep internal divisions within Ukraine, too, not just between Ukraine and the West.
Absolutely. He doesn't see Ukraine as a modern, integrated political structure. He describes it as deeply divided. You have Western Ukraine. He names regions like Ruthenia, Galicia, Volia, Lviv, which sees itself as fundamentally Western. Then there's a hybrid middle section, and the East, which is increasingly Russified. He even suggests Putin might agree that those Western parts could be much happier in some sort of confederation with the Poles.
So, potentially a fragmented Ukraine down the line, and a cold peace between Russia and the West. Is that the prediction?
That's his forecast. Macgregor anticipates Russians will treat the West with considerable suspicion for at least the next 2 decades, resulting in what he explicitly calls a cold peace. He thinks that while things here will change eventually in the U.S., he feels Trump is incapable of leading that particular change right now.
And Macgregor also brings in Russia's own historical identity struggles as being important here.
Yes, he delves into that, Russia's historical struggle with its identity.
Yeah.
He quotes Dostoevsky saying, "We're not really Europeans, we're almost Asiatic."
Yeah.
He even recounts an old story about a British ambassador during the Napoleonic Wars observing Tsar Alexander I's sort of schizophrenia pro-Western in St. Petersburg, but not in Moscow. And he concludes, "We Americans very much so have poisoned the water with the Russians for a long time, affecting this identity dynamic."
And for Europe specifically, what's the path forward for relations with Russia, in his view?
He suggests that if there's a turnover in the ruling elites in Western Europe, then he thinks things could improve there faster with Russia. He sees changing leadership in Europe as the most likely way for any kind of re-engagement. So the core insight here is Macgregor's picture of the post-war landscape. Ukrainian disillusionment, potential internal fragmentation, a long, cold peace between Russia and the West, all deeply shaped by history, grievances, and Russia's own identity questions.
So where does all this leave us? We've explored Colonel Macgregor's, well, very stark analysis of the battlefield, his insights into the contradictions he sees in U.S. foreign policy, and these deep historical and political currents he believes are reshaping Europe. The picture he paints is definitely one of fundamental shifts, really questioning the foundations of the post-Cold War order, suggesting a pretty dramatically different future.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, what it suggests is the world moving perhaps decisively beyond that unipolar dream, moving towards a new, maybe more fragmented, certainly more multipolar reality. A reality where nations really have to critically reevaluate their alliances, their security strategies. So the question for you, the learner, becomes, how will these profound geopolitical realignments, especially the potential changes to NATO, the U.S., possibly reverting to a more maritime-focused power, how will all that redefine what security and national interests even mean for countries around the globe in the years and decades ahead?